Okay, so I would like to start off with a big picture question about the US establishment and the groupthink. You speak a lot of truth about the US foreign policy and geopolitics. Now, one might say that should not be surprising because the US has freedom of speech and many smart people. So theoretically, there should be a lot of Jeffrey Sachs. But if you look at the media, think tanks, academics, politicians, etc., they all repeat the same narrative like zombies. And this is not even being patriotic, since they are fooling themselves with delusional propaganda. So, my question to you is, why is the situation so tragic, and what can be done to fix it?
Well, thank you very much. There has always been a lot of grandiosity in American thinking from the founding of the United States, even before the United States, from the founding of the British colonies in North America. The founders viewed themselves as very special, and they viewed their colonial settlements as very special, a kind of gift to the world. And in the 19th century, the famous expression was manifest destiny, a providential destiny for the English-speaking settlers on the east coast of North America, the founders of the United States, to conquer all of North America. And there were a lot of people there, a lot of indigenous nations. So there was a lot of genocide, a lot of warfare, all in the name of God, I have to say. So this was a grandiose exceptionalism. When the U.S. Completed its continental conquest at the end of the 1890s, it looked around the world and said, well, Europe has all these empires. It's time for us to have an empire as well abroad. And so the U.S. concocted a war with the waning Spanish Empire, the War of 1898, the Spanish-American War, and America grabbed colonies in the Caribbean and the Philippines. This began America's global venture. When the European disastrous civil war we call World War I ended, the European imperial powers were still standing, but they were weakened. The Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s weakened them further. The Second European Civil War, which we call World War II, essentially ended the European empires. And at the end of World War II, the American leaders said, hey, this is our world now. In fact, Henry Luce, the publisher of Time, in 1941 gave the slogan, the American century. This really went to the heads of the Americans. I have to say, they loved the idea. This was our world centuries. There's been a Mongol century. There's been British hegemony. Now it's America's turn to run the world. Of course, the world quickly divided into two parts, the U.S. And the Soviet-led world. Many newly independent countries said, we don't want either of them. We want to be non-aligned. But nonetheless, two nuclear superpowers battled it out in many proxy wars. When the Soviet Union ended in December 1991, the U.S. grandiosity was then complete because now the rival was gone. The U.S. could see itself as the sole superpower as far as the eye could see. They didn't even take notice of China at the time, which was just, as they imagined, a nation of rice-growing villages. It was not even something on the radar screen. Of course, not India. Of course, not other parts of the world. Russia looked crushed. So the U.S. Denominated itself as the indispensable nation, the world's sole superpower, the greatest power in the history of the world, greater than the Roman Empire, and on and on and on. I heard a lot of that going through my ears from the 1990s onward. I think what was different for me as an individual was that I was a practitioner of development economics. My perspective was always not the US, but poor countries that were trying to figure out what to do with themselves so that they could develop economically. And I was always looking at the United States from outside in. And I often didn't like what I saw. And especially from the 1990s onward, I really disliked what I saw. And it got worse and worse with the regime change, wars of choice, NATO enlargement, abandoning nuclear arms agreements such as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which the U.S. unilaterally abandoned in 2002, and the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which the U.S. unilaterally abandoned in 2019, and so forth. And so as my own life progressed with more and more experience internationally, and as the U.S. grandiosity, which we call neocon thinking or neoconservative thinking, progressed, I became really a vocal detester of what I saw as American arrogance. And I think the time abroad, which is nearly around the year, was definitely part of that. Now, I have to say there are many aspects of this American thinking, but one is a famous expression of one of our writers, Sinclair Lewis, who said it's impossible to convince a person of something when their job believes in believing the opposite. So there are a lot of people that are on hire. The American security state has its reach everywhere. It's $1 trillion direct security operation, but it goes well beyond that in terms of lobbying, in terms of the financial reach of American big industry, especially big oil, which plays a major role in the strategic settings of U.S. policy. So the East Coast think tanks, which I've been part of, Brookings Institution, Council on Foreign Relations, and so forth, are all pretty deeply enmeshed in the U.S. security state. And that leads to a lot of groupthink. It leads to a lot of repetition of the U.S. narrative. The most amazing thing about the U.S. narrative is not that the U.S. neocons debate the rest of the world. It's that they ignore the rest of the world. This is how it really works. We just don't hear any uptake of debate on issues such as how did the Ukraine war start? Why did it start? Who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? Or issues like that. There's no debate in the power centers. There's a narrative. And if there's a counter narrative, it's simply ignored. It's not refuted. It's not debated. It's not taken on and qualified. It's simply ignored. This is quite interesting. It makes you feel very strange, like you say things and they just go out into into the mist. But that's how it works. I finally realized no one wants to debate. People just make their assertions. The White House states its facts as it wants them to be believed, and that's the end of the story. Of course, most of the world doesn't believe this narrative because they see things with their own eyes. But Washington doesn't care. The idea is to proceed, not to win hearts and minds, not to convince anybody, just to proceed. This is a matter of power. That's what this is about. It's a matter of self-proclaimed exceptionalism. It's a matter of self-proclaimed hegemony. It's all delusional. It's dangerous. It's expensive. It's not working. But that's where we are.
Wow. Wow. That was a great explanation. Yeah. So the only way to fix it is if the U.S. Loses its power a little bit, and then the wisdom will slowly come in?
Well, I think what's happening is I've decided, look, it's not really worth arguing. Are we in a unipolar world, as Joe Biden, now in his reveries and imagination of the 1990s, believes? Or are we in a multipolar world? We're in a multipolar world, there's no doubt. China, Russia, India, these are separate great powers. There's no question about it. The U.S. doesn't know that or understand that. The U.S. tells itself fables every day. Oh, we're still in charge. We're still the number one. We lead the free world. Whatever is said. But the fact is we're already in a multipolar world. Now, this is a dangerous world when you have one of the superpowers that says it's unipolar and the rest say, well, no, not exactly. The U.S. says we get to put NATO where we want, including in Ukraine. Russia says, well, no, not exactly. The U.S. says we get to arm Taiwan no matter what China says. China says, well, no, not exactly. So we have a growing clash between what I would consider to be American delusions and the ground reality. Now, that's very dangerous. It has created an open war in Ukraine. It could create an open, even more dangerous war between the U.S. and China over Taiwan. We have our generals that talk openly about this, even though it's worse than a nightmare. You can't even imagine how disastrous this would be for the world and for the U.S., but it's talked about openly as if it's kind of a board game or a video game. So the world's dangerous because of this ongoing delusion, but we're already in a multipolar world. Now, what to do about it? To my mind, it's to help the U.S. out of its delusions peacefully, calmly, but clearly. No, you can't do that. No, the world doesn't agree with you. No, you don't really lead the whole world. And I like to count numbers for my fellow Americans. The U.S. population is 335 million people. Europe's population is 450 million people, the EU. So that's about 800 million people. Add in Britain, add in Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Korea. You're maybe at, depending on exactly who you include, at 1 billion to 1.2 billion people out of 8 billion. Well, it's not so impressive. You're between 10 and 15% of the world population. The other 85% are scratching their heads and saying, what is going on? We don't want this war in Ukraine. We don't want a war in Asia. We don't want American unilateral sanctions. Of course, we still have, if you want to talk about fantasy world, the U.S. is delusional, but Britain is completely a fantasy land because they still think they're an empire. They're 60 million people in a mess on the island of Britain, in a mess. But they talk like, oh, we're going to beat the Russians in Ukraine. And yes, we do this and we do that. So that's really imperial nostalgia and delusion. And so the question is, can this be brought down in time to actually make peace and, even better than that, cooperation to solve some very, very big problems? Because the world is beset not only by these direct conflicts, but by terrible environmental crises and many other crises that need to be addressed in a cooperative way. And we've put aside all that cooperation. These so-called American leaders, they don't talk about the UN. They don't talk about global goals. They don't talk about the Paris Climate Agreement. We don't hear about any of this. We just hear about Russia and China and how the free world has to confront the authoritarian world and so on. So we're not hearing about any global problem solving right now. And of course, we're standing shoulder to shoulder with genocide led by Israel right now. So it's a quite huge mess. But my thought about this, honestly, is the vast majority of the world wants something different. It should really remain calm, not meet the U.S. with its counter delusions, but just remain calm and say we believe in international law, in the United Nations, in the UN Charter, in the General Assembly, in the UN Security Council, in the International Court of Justice, in the ICC, and others. Let's make that system work, because that's the only one that can give us some security that we stay alive and avoid a great power conflict that could end the world.
So, okay. So I'm trying to figure out what is going through the minds of the blobs, the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, and Wall Street, and all those people. So, do they really believe what they're saying, or they're just bluffing like a card game?
A little bit of both, and I think, because I try to figure out that answer as the answer to that question as well, and of course they don't tell me their innermost thoughts, so I have to infer them. But part of it is a bit bureaucratic, which is that decisions taken back in the 1990s still remain the policy today, and this is true as administrations come and go. Basically, when the Soviet Union ended, the United States policy, grand strategy, if you want to give it a big name, was we will be the unipolar power. We will expand NATO. Then as China rose, we will surround China with our military in Japan, Korea, in parts of Southeast Asia, in Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And these are deep strategies. They're not changed year to year, even administration to administration, and they are decidedly not changed by my op-eds, So they're not thinking day to day to reanalyze this. They are carrying out a plan. Zbig Brzezinski, who was very clever and very influential, wrote in 1997 in Foreign Affairs magazine, the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations, a piece called A Strategy for Eurasia. And it laid out a 15-year plan for NATO enlargement, including saying that between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine would come in, assuming that it met the criteria and so forth. 2008 turned out to be the year in which Ukraine was invited to NATO membership, though without a specific roadmap. To my mind, that's indicative. Brzezinski's article was 1997. It reflected already Washington thinking of several years. So it probably reflected a kind of consensus from 1993 or 1994. It was collected and presented in 1997, and you could see it playing out for the next 15 years. In other words, this is pretty deeply entrained. And the project to bring NATO to Ukraine, or Ukraine as a member of NATO, I think is essentially almost a 30-year project. And the way that bluff came in was the U.S. figured it would invite Ukraine, and Russia objected, but so what? And so it would just move forward. And then things got in the way. And one thing that got in the way was President Viktor Yanukovych, who was elected in 2010, and he wanted neutrality for Ukraine. He represented the ethnic Russians in the east, and most Ukrainians at the time wanted neutrality. They don't want to get into a mess between the two superpowers. But the U.S. said, okay, this guy's a problem. We're going to conspire in his overthrow. And the U.S. played a role in the revolution of February 2014. A lot of U.S. money went into the overthrow of Yanukovych. And the day that the right wing stormed the government buildings, the U.S. said, we recognize the new government. It didn't say, wait a minute, that's extra constitutional. That's a power grab. We have to bring Yanukovych safely back to Ukraine. It didn't say anything like that. In a nanosecond, it recognized the new government. That's how the U.S. participates in coups. So what did they think? They thought they would get away with it. Well, President Putin took back Crimea. That's not good. And then Russia cleverly helped to negotiate the Minsk II agreement, which was endorsed by the UN Security Council, which called for a diplomatic resolution for the ethnic Russian regions of eastern Ukraine, Lugansk and Donetsk. But then the United States said, we don't have to go along with Russia. Putin. No way. We'll just blow that off, even though we voted for it in the Security Council. That's a bluff again. But they didn't get away with it because Putin said, no, you can't just ignore what you have voted. And he put on the table a security agreement in December 2021 for negotiation with the U.S. I said at the time, negotiate, avoid a larger war. What President Putin's proposing is perfectly sensible. It ends NATO enlargement. It stops unilateral placement of intermediate range missiles in Europe. It does many things. Stop. The White House told me, no, we can do what we want, because the delusion continued. So that was kind of a bluff. We don't think that Putin will carry on. Then came the special military operation. Then they bluffed again, or they thought, well, our sanctions will be enough to prevail. We'll crush Russia by pushing Russian banks out of the SWIFT clearing system, by putting in HIMARS and ATACMS and other wonder weapons and so forth. So when you ask, is it a bluff or is it real? It's kind of both. They are playing poker. They're lousy players, by the way. They don't understand anything about the game. They don't understand that the other side can have a good hand. They don't understand that for the other side, it can't be a matter of bluff. They're not ready to listen to the other side. They don't want to discuss with the other side. They think that negotiation is weakness, which is one of the stupidest ideas on our planet, because they don't even understand what the Russian position is, I feel. Or they're so dumb that they think that they can either bluff or scare or defeat Russia, none of which is possible. So the answer is they do play poker very badly. And the U.S. Keeps losing war after war, hand after hand. U.S. power is waning. We are in a multipolar world, but the U.S. doesn't relent. It keeps raising the stakes. It's absolutely uncanny. It's a terrible way to play poker, and it's endangering all of us because, frankly, those stakes are mine, not just the people playing them. They're my life, my family's life, my tax dollars, many things. And I resent how badly they play their hand.
Wow. Okay. So they tried the regime change in Russia. That didn't work out.
In Ukraine and in Russia, of course.
Yeah.
But yes.
And then they're doing some really crazy things in the Middle East. I cannot even understand what their final objective is. But we know that they would definitely want to contain China, to defeat China. What is their plan? I mean, it seems so ridiculous. For example, I was reading this article about the U.S., the weapons manufacturers, and they all depend on Chinese products. Like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and all these people. They cannot make a missile without Chinese components. So what is their final strategy with China? And will there ever be wisdom, some wise people in the blob to try to secure a new framework with China and Russia?
I can tell you, looking back, the blob never understood China's rise. And as early as I've been involved in this issue, from the 1990s onward actively, they thought China was a bubble. China's economy would burst. This is a myth, the myth of the East Asian miracle. Many things were said. So they never took seriously China's rise and didn't understand it. And then it suddenly dawned on them. I put it to the year 2014, which was a year that China did two things. One, China announced the Belt and Road Initiative around that moment, and China announced the Made in China 2025 policy to really push forward on key cutting-edge technologies. Then the U.S. freaked out, and you can read very interesting documents that basically say, oh my God, now we have to contain China. well, a little naive for a country of 335 million to contain a country of 1.4 billion when the country of 1.4 billion has twice the manufacturing capacity as the country of 335 million people and an overall economy measured at international prices that is probably 25% smaller, 30% smaller. In other words, the U.S. can't contain China, but it's trying to do so. It's trying to do so militarily. It's trying to do so because it believes that it can keep the technological edge by restricting the flow of advanced microchips to China and so forth. All of this, to my mind, again, is mean-spirited, delusional, confrontational when we should be cooperative. China's not a threat to the United States. It's not a threat to the world. It's just a country catching up for lost time after a long history, especially in the 19th century and first half of the 20th century when it fell way behind because of wars of invasion in China, civil war, the Taiping Rebellion. Many things went wrong in China for 150 years. China's making up for lost time very well, but it's not a threat to the U.S. It's not a threat to anybody. We should be applauding China's progress. But the U.S. policymakers see China as an affront and a threat to U.S. hegemony, which is a delusional idea, but still there. So they're trying to contain China. It won't work, but it's extremely dangerous. And these idiotic generals of ours are talking about a war over Taiwan. And God forbid, first of all. And second, they're not going to win that war. A war 60 miles off the coast of China with a great power that has an existential fight compared to the U.S., which is like in Ukraine, but even more, a war of choice that makes no sense for the U.S. and which the U.S. public would never support. So the whole thing is, again, wrong-headed and dangerous. What should the U.S. do? It should be friends with China and with Russia, by the way. There's absolutely no reason for these fundamental conflicts. There are no reasons. This is not some fight to the finish. Russia doesn't threaten the United States except if we're in conflict. But we don't need to be in conflict. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy if we say we don't care what Russia says. If we listen to Russia and Russia said, leave some space between your military and ours so that Ukraine can be neutral, we should say, great idea. Thanks, God. Let's just take care. Let's be prudent. And none of this would have happened.